Hi there, and welcome to MadPow's webinar series. For those of you not familiar with us, we're a design agency that strives to help people improve their health and wellness, meet their financial goals, learn, and connect. But enough about us. Today, Amy Bucher, Behavior Change Design Director, will share her insights on engagement is everything, how to apply psychology to improve digital experiences. A little bit about Amy. Amy has always been fascinated with how things, and especially people, work. Her interest drove her choice to become a psychologist and why she came to apply psychology to behavior change design. Before coming to MadPow, Amy worked at CVS Health, Johnson & Johnson Health and Wellness Solutions, and Big Communications. Amy has her Ph.D. and MA from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and her AB from Harvard University. So now that you know her, here are a few housekeeping items before we get started. We'll be sure 15 minutes at the end for questions, so make sure to put them in the sidebar as a direct message to me, the host, or in the group. We'll be live tweeting with #MadPow. Slides will be available on our site in a couple of days, and notifications will be sent out through our social media channels, including Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Google+. So be sure you're following us on all channels. There you can also learn about upcoming webinars, speaking engagements, events, and more. And with that, I'll turn it over to Amy.
Thanks, Liz. So as Liz mentioned, in my role here at MadPow, I spend most of my time thinking about how to build experiences that move people toward greater health and happiness, especially digital experiences. And one thing that I've learned is that even more important than whether your experience works is whether people use it. There's a famous quote from the former U.S. Surgeon General C. Everett Koop that drugs don't work in patients who don't take them. The same is true of any digital intervention. They don't work by magic, they work of whether digital applications are being used. One of the most comprehensive recent studies of workplace digital health interventions, the 2013 RAND survey, found some pretty eligible to take them. Among those people, fewer than half of them take HRAs and wellness screenings. Only about 10% enroll in their weight loss interventions. Only about 16% participate in disease management programs, which are programs designed to help with things like diabetes or hypertension. And only 7% take smoking cessation programs. On the right, you'll see the Gallup organization has found similar results. Their overall conclusion is that only 24% of people who have access to a wellness program through work use it. And the results that you see here aren't limited to health programs. World at Work looked at financial education and well-being programs, and they found that those were even less utilized than health programs at work. There are a lot of reasons why this might be the case. Some people may not be in the motivational place where they want to get started. They just haven't reached a point in their personal lives where they feel the urge to change. Some people may not be aware these programs are available. Sometimes people distrust having these programs offered through an employer, or they prefer not to mix health and work or financial wellness and work. But another issue, and the one that I want to focus on today, is that people aren't engaged by the programs that they're offered. The programs aren't designed in a way that psychologically hooks people and gets them to keep going with the experience. I do want to pause here and make the note that when people do take these programs, they often work pretty well. Efficacy of the interventions is not the problem. Engagement is. Another way to think about it if you're mathematically minded is in terms of outcomes. So you can see here an equation, and the goal of pretty much any program is to achieve outcomes, whether it's lowering costs or making people healthier. Outcomes are a function of efficacy, which I just noted is usually pretty good in evidence-based interventions, and also participation, which data shows tends to be poor. If participation is zero, so is outcomes. Another important point I want to make sure you walk away with is that participation is not the same thing as engagement. Logging into a digital intervention once is participation. And in fact, many companies who measure participation would count someone who logged in once as engaged. I would argue that for most digital interventions, a single login is not likely to yield a meaningful experience. And that's why I want to talk about engagement rather than just participation. So engagement is motivation, particularly over time. A definition of motivation that I really like is that it's desire with velocity. It's the idea of wanting an outcome enough to repeatedly take action to make that outcome more likely. I like using the example of the movie Office Space to illustrate the definition of motivation. If you haven't seen it, I recommend it. It's actually aged very well. In Office Space, Peter loses his inhibitions at his terrible office job, and he stops doing meaningless work and pandering to management. He points out that his lack of work isn't because he's lazy. It's because he lacks the desire to complete the job tasks. He lacks motivation. So someone has motivation over time within a task is who I would call engaged. The actual tactics that we can use to engage people in a digital experience vary depending on the specific type of experience we want to create. I'd say this is one of the most fruitful areas of collaboration between different types of designers, so behavior change designers and interaction designers and visual designers, where behavior change experts can help define the underlying psychological mechanisms for engagement, and then their colleagues can help bring them to life. Being on the behavior change side myself, I'm going to dive into one of the most well-researched and applied theories of engagement in the field, self-determination theory. This theory provides a robust framework for building digital experiences that engage people over time. So a key concept in self-determination theory is that motivation isn't just a high-low or yes-no quality. There are actually multiple different types of motivation that run along a continuum depending on their source. On the left, you see amotivated, or no motivation at all. This is just not taking action. Next, as we proceed closer to the right, we dive into the sources of motivation that come from outside the self. These are called controlled motivation. The most external type of motivation, which is sometimes also called external motivation, comes fully from someone or something else. So maybe a doctor or a spouse, and the desire to earn money is what's causing a person to do something. Next to that, we have introjected. Introjected motivation comes from within oneself, but only in the sense that it's been internalized. So an example that really resonates with me here is the idea of a college student who's going pre-med because her parents expect it. At some point, she may internalize that desire, but if she never really adopts it in a meaningful way, it remains introjected motivation. One thing to keep in mind about both extrinsic and introjected motivation is that they're relatively vulnerable to barriers. If your nagging spouse doesn't know that you have donuts available at work, you might sneak one. Or if the pre-med major is making you miserable and you're only doing it to please your parents, you might eventually reach a breaking. These are in the self, which helps to strengthen them against those sorts of barriers. First is identified motivation. This happens when you have some sort of goal and you perceive behaviors as stepping stones to get to that goal. So to go back to the example of the pre-med student, if she has a really strong goal of helping children lead better lives and sees becoming a doctor as a way that she can achieve that, then she might have identified motivation. That would be a stronger source of motivation than just doing something because her parents want her to or because she wants to please her parents. Next is integrated, and this is when a behavior supports a person's deeper identity. So maybe you think of yourself as a healthy person and that motivates you to resist ice cream after dinner. Or you think of yourself as a fit person and that motivates you to lace up your sneakers. Integrated motivation is really about living into the values that a person has and aligning behaviors with those values. And then finally, on the far right, we have the holy grail of motivation, intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation happens when something is desirable for its own sake. It feels good to do. This type of motivation in its purest form is relatively rare, but any activity that comes through intrinsic motivation will persist even through tough barriers. As you might imagine, the more autonomous a motivation type, the more likely it is to drive long-term, lasting behavior change. And research has consistently proven this out. One study that I'll share with you looked at the different impact of different types of motivation over engagement. This is a really interesting study. It looked at West Point graduates and their military careers. So the researchers had the opportunity to survey West Point students at the start of their freshman year and then track them over time to see how their actual military careers played out. They looked initially at what was motivating the students to go to West Point in the first place and then classified those reasons as either intrinsic or extrinsic types of motivation, so either autonomous or controlled types of motivation. Some of those autonomous types of motivations, including feeling patriotism or wanting to develop leadership skills. The more extrinsic motivators included things like thinking the military was a good career path, or really being drawn by the steady paycheck of the military. So what the study found, consistent with what you would expect from self-determination theory, is that cadets who went to West Point for those more intrinsic reasons were more likely to have career success. And what the researchers specifically looked at was whether they became an officer, whether they got promoted early, and whether they stayed on in the military past their minimum commitment. And again, just as we'd predict, people who started West Point for extrinsic reasons did less well on those same metrics. What's really interesting, though, I think most of us in the real world, most of the time, are doing things for a mix of reasons. It's possible to have more than one type of motivation at once. And so it was the same with these West Point cadets. A lot of them joined because they had a strong sense of patriotism or really wanted to serve, but also really felt that there were some instrumental values in the career. And what we saw in the study was that these sorts of mixed motives actually looked a lot more like the mostly extrinsic. It led to less career success than pure intrinsic motives. The suggestion here is that the extent to which we can get people purely over in that autonomous side of motivation, the more successful the outcomes will be and the more engaged they may be over time. So how do we move people over? The way that we do this is by working what I call the levers of motivation. So regardless of our individual differences, everybody shares three basic psychological needs. These are autonomy, or the desire to make our own meaningful choices, and the word meaningful is important there. Competence, or the need to learn and grow, and also to see ourselves learning and growing. And then finally, relatedness, which is this idea of belonging to something bigger than oneself. So that can mean having social relationships with other people. It can also mean finding a greater meaning in your life or feeling like you're part of a community. If we design experiences that support these three fundamental psychological needs, we can help move people along the motivational continuum closer to the intrinsic end. We become engaged as users when experiences support our most vital needs. At a high level, these are some guidelines for supporting fundamental needs within an experience. I'm going to give examples and illustrations of each of these, but it can also be helpful to see them listed together. For autonomy, some of the basic ideas include establishing shared rules of engagement. If we're empowering people to make choices, part of that is also providing them with the necessary information to make an informed choice. If people make a choice believing one thing and then the rules change, they'll feel autonomy deprived. Next is minimizing external pressure, whether that's pressure from financial rewards, rules and regulations, well-intentioned nagging, whatever the case may be. And third, giving people choice whenever you can within an experience. For supporting competence, some of the key tactics include making developmentally appropriate demands, which is basically not asking people to do things where they don't have the tools, the skills, the abilities. There's also the idea of offering relevant feedback, especially when you do it in a timely enough fashion so that people can use it to actually improve their performance. And then finally, there's this idea of creating optimal challenge. So selecting tasks that are at the edge of somebody's abilities to help stretch their skills without being so difficult that it's frustrating or so easy that it's boring and you lose their attention. And then finally, for relatedness, some of the key tactics include communicating warmth and positive feeling, which is essentially creating a sense of a relationship between the user and the experience. Creating a sense of involvement, which can be as simple as interacting with somebody in a way that's authentic and real. And then finally, conveying belongingness, which is letting people know that they're part of something bigger than themselves. So let's talk about some specific examples of digital experiences that can support people's sense of autonomy, that feeling of having control over important or meaningful choices. So I mentioned that one way to support autonomy is to give people the necessary information in advance of making a choice so that they can really make an informed choice and feel like they own the consequences of it. This is something that design-wise probably comes up most often during the onboarding process. So why are you asking for my birth date? What are you going to do with my email address? Setting these sorts of expectations is important to help users in a digital experience feel like they got exactly what they bargained for. On a more serious note, the example that I'm showing here has to do with better health outcomes. In a study with Dartmouth-Hitchcock, ME Solutions provided detailed education to folks about to undergo a colonoscopy, which I think we all know is a very unpleasant medical experience, but a fact of life. And their education provided these people with exactly the information about what was going to happen to them. They found that people who had this education, who really understood the procedure, went into it needing less medication. They were able to finish the procedure more quickly, and then afterwards they rated themselves as more knowledgeable. So the point here is that an experience as objectively unpleasant as a colonoscopy can be improved, that people can be more engaged with it if you give them those shared rules of engagement prior. I also mentioned minimizing external pressure, and ideally everyone would be able to choose to use a digital program or not without any pressure from incentives or rules or nagging. Realistically, that's not often likely to be the case. External incentives or payments, for example, are really the industry norm for certain types of digital health interventions. If you can't totally avoid external pressures, you can at least mitigate their negative impact on autonomy in a few different ways. So the first one is keeping reward amounts reasonable. Research shows that if you overpay somebody for doing an activity, even one that they really enjoy, like playing video games, that actually reduces the intrinsic motivation they feel over time for that activity. And this has been shown on a neurological level. This isn't just a self-report outcome. Overcompensating for some activities is also ethically dubious depending on what those activities are. So for example, research participation, if you overpay somebody to the extent where they really can't realistically say no, that's a form of coercion. So keep those reward amounts as small as you can. Second, tie rewards back to meaningful behaviors. So I'll touch on this again. I have a few examples that go more specifically into this. But for now, just think about defining what are the actions that really matter and tying the rewards there. So if you have a health risk assessment, is it that you care about people registering for it, or do you care that they actually submit the data? Tie the reward to the submission of the data, not to the initial registration. And then third, if at all possible, think about non-financial rewards that are related to what you're trying to accomplish. So there's been some pretty good success with giving fitness gear or free gym memberships for workout challenges and other sorts of fitness interventions. That way the reward reinforces the desired actions both directly and indirectly. Giving people lots of choice also helps support autonomy. And one domain where this tends to be done really well, and not coincidentally is a domain where people get very, very engaged, is video games. So this screen is from Mass Effect 2. Shows the wide array of choices that players have to customize their avatar. And the choices that you make during this initial setup period go on to influence your gameplay for the duration of your experience. This is a different video game. This is called Witcher 3. And you can see at the bottom that the player has multiple options throughout the game to influence the course of action. So I'm more of an analog person myself. I think of this like a modern choose-your-own-adventure book. And then this is Fallout 4, so similar sort of idea, the role-playing game choice of next action, and then again it cascades out in the way your experience plays out. You can also offer choices in non-game contexts. So what you see here is mindbloom, which is an online program that helps improve health and well-being. And users get to direct their experience at multiple points during mindbloom. First, and perhaps most importantly, they get to express their important core values by picking which domains of well-being they want to work on, whether it's physical wellness, finances, relationships, career, what have you. And then within that, they have lots of additional choice about how to tackle those areas. So what activities to try, when to try them, how often to try them. Another example from a program that bridges online and offline experiences, there's actually two. These are related to weight gain or weight loss. Weight Watchers, and then the 21-day fix is what you see on the screen right now. So once you decide to lose weight and you enroll in any sort of intervention, what you've essentially agreed to do is you're reducing the calories in, you're increasing the calories out. That's the math of weight loss. But how exactly that gets accomplished leaves a lot up to the individual. So what you see here with the 21-day fix is you have these containers. You can fill each container with whatever type of specific item that falls into the category you want. So, whatever protein you like, whatever veggies you like, lots of choice within the structure. And then Weight Watchers, which you can see now, offers all sorts of calculators and tools to help people customize their experience within the larger framework. So one thing that realistically we also know is that just offering people choices doesn't mean they'll make the quote-unquote right choice or the ones that you as a product designer want them to. And that's why it's also possible to build nudges into your experience that will increase the likelihood of people freely choosing the path that you would like them to choose. So one type of choice nudge is value-consistent framing. This pulls from a couple of different psychological concepts. First, it taps into that identified motivation that we talked about earlier. So people are more motivated to do something if they see it as being consistent with a goal they really value. Second, it leverages cognitive dissonance, which is this idea that we like to be very consistent between our values and our behaviors. If you can frame a particular behavior as exemplifying something a person really values, you've increased the emotional appeal of doing that behavior. And you can see this really done well sometimes, especially in face-to-face therapy and coaching context, where somebody may point out, you say you really value your family, but we see that you are smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day. Done well, that kind of conversation can really help people start to make the decision to change. I would caution that you have to use this tactic with skill and subtlety, and I'd recommend saving it for really critical behaviors and behaviors that can genuinely be said to reflect whatever value you're trying to tie it into. So this particular tactic of value-consistent framing has been really commonly abused lately in pop-ups to gather email addresses for newsletters, which, admittedly may be an important tactic for some purposes, but is probably not mission-critical for really anything. So just a few examples here of what that looks like. So here's one where if you don't sign up for the email address or the email newsletter, you are a foolish spender, so you don't value your money. Or even worse, you're an idiot who rejects awesome freebies. Total square who hates running wild, whatever that is, probably me. And then finally, I love this one. You're someone who despises creativity if you refrain from signing up for Paul Jarvis's newsletter. And what I really love about this is that I know what the source of this. It's a BuzzFeed article titled 15 Passive-Aggressive Websites with Absolutely No Chill. So whatever else you think about Paul Jarvis, he's really good at cherry-picking quotes. Another nudge you can use to move people toward the so-called correct choice is to make that choice the most appealing one. A really common way of doing this is comparing plan options side by side in a way that makes it very clear which one is better. The key components to this are not just showing what's so good about the better option, but also what's missing from the non-preferred option. People are really loss-averse, and showing something in this way helps to trigger our drive to avoid losses. The visual design here can also help emphasize the preferred choice and make it more appealing. So bolder colors, there's a lot more going on visually, makes it a lot easier to click there. You can extend this principle of making the desired choice appealing into the physical world as well. So you may have seen these videos. They were very popular a few years ago. There were some attempts in Europe to get people to walk the stairs more instead of taking escalators and elevators. And so in subway stations, they added these piano keys to the stairs. And they actually make noise when you walk on them. So it's pretty cool, a lot of fun. And what they found is that when these piano staircases were in place, more people took the stairs. So this is an example of using real-world physical design to influence behavior while also supporting autonomy. Once you become aware that the architects of both digital and physical experiences use this idea of making the preferred choice more appealing, you'll start to notice examples of it everywhere. So paths laid out in public spaces, options available in video games. This is really, really common, and when done well, it can actually be quite delightful. So next, let's move on to how digital experiences might support competence, or that sense of learning and growing. The best description of ability that I've heard comes from B.J. Fogg, who says that ability is a function of whatever resource is scarcest at a given time. So that could be money, it could be time, it could be knowledge, it could be tools. A way to support competence within the experiences you build is to remove barriers as much as possible. So essentially lowering that threshold of ability. Some examples where this has been done include studies in Europe that show that when you make becoming an organ donor an opt-out process instead of an opt-in when you get your driver's license, you get much more participation. It's easier to just let that box stay the way it is than to uncheck it and reject membership in the program. Similarly, and this is one where there's been a lot of research on personal finance, people are more likely to donate money, or not donate, invest money in their 401k if it's an opt-out instead of an opt-in. So that's something that more employers have started to do in order to help protect their employees' financial health. And then finally, in health, this is another finding from ME Solutions, where they found that if they put those automated doctor reminder calls for mammograms, if at the end of the call they automatically connected the woman to her doctor's scheduling office, they were much more likely to follow through on making an appointment, because they no longer had to go through the bother of looking up the phone number, dialing it, maybe not getting connected. So really removing those barriers to ability. Measuring and tracking are also a great way to support competence. Just measuring something without any intervention at all can result in improvements. So the example here comes from the airline industry. This is a paper that is not yet published, actually. But the study found that pilots could be influenced to operate their planes more efficiently just by knowing that somebody was monitoring their behavior. And you can see in the chart, they actually efficiently, and then measuring them against the goal. And then charity donation was, if you hit the goal, we'll give money to a choice. And what you can see is that the monitoring only, just knowing you were being watched, is almost as effective, non-significantly different from the other types of interventions. There are also a lot of related examples in health where fitness, diet, and biometrics really lend themselves to measurement and baselining. Intervention. So double the weight loss in people who keep a food diary versus not. You can see more dieting success. You see some people who keep the food diary, and then an amazing 27% boost in steps just from wearing a pedometer. To make feedback even more powerful, then you can start to layer in context so people know how their performance matches norms. This example is from O-Power. It's a utility company that sends normative reports about your electric usage so that you can see if you're energy efficient or not. So the number of kilowatt hours you use for most of us doesn't really mean anything in its own right. But if you see yourself compared to neighbors and then also see yourself compared to your most energy efficient neighbors, now you start to get a feel for whether you're normal, you're using too much electricity. In one study, they found that households who received this report use between 1.4 and 3.3% less energy. Doesn't sound like a lot, but that's actually a huge energy savings when you think about it over a neighborhood or a city or an even larger region from a relatively easy intervention. Then even more targeted than normative baselining is direct feedback. So again, this is something video games do incredibly well. This screen is from Call of Duty Advanced Warfare, and you can see where the red circles are. Players can see exactly where their shots land and instantly recalibrate their performance based on that feedback. But even a game that's less realistic than this can still be engaging. So this is Glider Classic, which as you can see is not particularly artistically impressive, but in research studies, you can see it also has very clear feedback mechanisms, and people were very engaged with playing it and would continue to play it longer than they had to in the studies. Another trick besides making feedback clear and actionable is to provide it at more than one level. So this screen from Rock Band shows how you can give granular feedback here at the bottom on a person's specific action. So this is, did you hit the right note? And if you didn't, you can visually see how far off you were, so you can calibrate your performance. Then at the top of the screen, you can see your overall performance over time. So having these different levels of feedback can be really helpful when you're asking people to participate in a long process. So think about weight loss, where you may be tracking your daily calories and your daily exercise, but you're also looking at the pounds that you lose over time. Giving feedback at multiple levels can help people be more resilient when they do something poorly, if they can still see that they're made overall progress. So it's a lot easier to not beat yourself up about a day of dietary indulgence if you know that you're still making progress toward your weight loss goal. This is another example of feedback, which you may be familiar with if you've read the book Nudge. So adding a sticker that looks like a fly to the inside of a urinal improves men's aim in the bathroom. And you can buy these sorts of stickers on Amazon. They actually have a lot of different models. Some of them are heat sensitive, very fun. And according to this particular product listing, using the stickers increases the cleanliness of bathrooms by 80%. So I can't vouch for that statistic. That doesn't come from a research study as far as I know, but I can tell you that people have consistently reported improvements in cleanliness when these stickers are used. So feedback. Another type of feedback that's become quite common is badging. So you see this a lot, especially in apps. Foursquare, which is now known as Swarm, is kind of the granddaddy of this. Badges are awarded based on behaviors such as checking into a location on your phone. And then the badges are visible to others. They're a shareable signifier of actions taken. Badges do have their own problems, though. So if the badge isn't rewarded for the right behavior, if it's not aligned with what really matters, people may game the system to try to get the badges without doing what you're actually trying to get them to do. So Foursquare retired their fitness badges several years ago, partially because they really rewarded you using your phone in proximity to a gym rather than going inside and using the gym in proximity to your phone. So as Scott Rigby points out in the quote here on the left, users began to game the system looking to circumvent the health behaviors simply to get the badge. I also mentioned before that if you must give rewards, they should align with the desired behavior, and Starbucks is a great example of a company that's done a good job with this. Their mobile app rewards coffee purchases by giving you more coffee, which creates a cycle that accomplishes exactly what Starbucks wants, which is for you to drink and buy their coffee. The app has been enormously successful, as you can see from these stats. It's just really one of the most successful, financially speaking, apps in the industry. Another powerful way to use feedback is with if-then scenarios, where you allow people to understand possible outcomes of changing their behavior in specific ways. So these scenarios don't have to be high-tech. The one on the left is something called the snowball debt calculator. It's an Excel spreadsheet, and it lets you figure out how to tackle multiple debts depending on whether you want to minimize your payments or pay them off quickly, or is there a specific one you'd like to pay off first. You can play out a lot of if-then scenarios and then make the decision about how to actually pay off your debt. The one on the right is a little bit more sophisticated. It shows your risk of cardiovascular disease, and again, you can play with different variables and see what would happen if I lost weight, what would happen if I quit smoking. These tools really support competence by helping people understand the connection between their behaviors and outcomes. Another thing you can do to support user competence is structure the subtasks that are part of an experience very thoughtfully. So for example, if you have a time-consuming task like a long survey, one thing that it can be recommended is putting the easiest questions last. So that way, you're asking people to use their brain power when it's freshest on the harder questions, and then you let them go on autopilot when they get mentally tired for easy things like demographics and what's your address. If you have a learning or growth-oriented experience, it might make sense to structure tasks from easy to hard, so that as people learn something in an easier task, they can then start to apply that knowledge in the harder task. So that, in fact, is what Duolingo does. Duolingo is a free online language learning program. It breaks each language into lesson learning units, and they're very thoughtfully structured from most basic to more complicated. Every single lesson builds on the ones before. So you can see over here, that's the first thing that Duolingo does to support competence. Other things that it does, it gives you points, and this is, again, feedback at multiple levels. So you receive points for every lesson you complete, and you can see how you did on each individual question, but then you can also see how you're doing over time. So you have your streak if you are earning points on multiple days in a row. And then finally, it gives you normative feedback, as well as a social component, by sharing a leaderboard where you can see how your experience points stack up to friends. So what's most impressive about this type of competence support is that it really does seem to work to engage people and produce outcomes. Duolingo commissioned a study where they found that 34 hours of Duolingo produced the same language skills achievement as a full college semester of the language. And 34 hours sounds like a lot, but if you do the math, it's actually less than a college semester of a language in terms of time spent. The final need supported by engaging experiences is relatedness, or the feeling of connection or belongingness. So human beings have a fundamental need for relationships. That's something that's been recognized for monkeys, which you see on the left. If you like animals, it's actually really, really sad, but he found that depriving infant monkeys of their mothers meant that they would cling to these very uncomfortable wire dolls that sort of looked like monkeys looking for comfort because they were just so in need of that connection. On the right, you see Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and you can see that love, belonging, that relationship is right in the middle of the hierarchy of needs. He really recognized it as one of the most fundamental things that human beings need. More recent studies have found that being ostracized or kept out of social relationships can have really significant negative effects on mood and health and well-being. So the screens here come from research studies by Kip Williams. He created this rudimentary video game where he found that you can be ostracized by these avatars, and that leads to some pretty significant low mood and other negative effects. The most common way that people experience relatedness or not in digital experiences today is through social networking. So this is a graphic from the agency Just3, and I just wanted to bring home the point that there are so many social technologies available, and the number is just growing every day. If you do use one of these social networks in your digital experience, the key is to use it interactively. You see a lot of companies will create a Twitter account or a Facebook page, and they just use it to push information in one direction without actually using it to be social. So that doesn't really help build relatedness, and it might even get in the way of relatedness if people come to that place looking for interaction and then they can't get it. On the other hand, companies that are interactive can build loyalty and devotion from customers. So this example is from Boston Organics, which is a company here in Boston that delivers seasonal fruits and veggies. And they're both reactive on Twitter and proactive. So you can see they're reactive in that they respond to people who address them directly. And they're proactive in that they actually monitor and they look for not just their own name in people's tweets, but they also look for topics that are relevant to their business, and then they'll respond. So they do a really nice job of building a relationship through social media. Humor can also work well to build relatedness as long as that fits your brand and the experience that you're trying to create. So this is an example from Dollar Shave Club on Facebook, and they did a great job going through and replying to almost every single user who offered a comment, but they also did so pretty consistently with a sense of humor. So does the wine come with it? Wine sold separately, that sort of thing. I mentioned feedback as a way to support competence, but it's also something that you can use to support relatedness if you can help people understand that they're not alone. So normative feedback can be a really powerful tool to help people feel connected. The trick is finding the right balance between helping people feel like they're not alone and not letting them feel like they don't have to change because everybody else is doing it. So this research finding at the top, this is actually true. Recent research shows that many people may try to quit smoking more than 30 times before they finally succeed. So quitting smoking is really hard, and it takes most people a lot of tries. So if you've tried and you've failed, that's okay. It doesn't mean that you'll never quit smoking. But you have to be able to communicate that in a way that helps a person Normative feedback can also be tricky if a person is genuinely doing unusually poorly, if they're really not similar to everybody else. So usually in a case like that, what I try to do is avoid giving the normative feedback about that particular item and then do it for something else that's more neutral or more value neutral. So rather than letting somebody know that, yes, you're among the most overweight people in this program, you might say, you're not alone in having difficulty finding time to exercise. So that way you avoid making a person feel bad about the areas where they are negatively different and instead help them feel the ways that they are the same. Another way to support relatedness is through personalizing the experience. A few current technologies that do this really well include Google Now, which you can see on the left. That's actually a screenshot from my phone a while back when it was still 63 degrees and not 93 degrees. It looks through my email and my phone data with my permission to provide me with insights about my commute, upcoming things on my calendar, my favorite sports teams, and so forth. Siri, who everybody I think is familiar with at this point, also personalized technology. And then finally Alexa, which is the new Amazon AI personality in the Echo speaker, and it's coming increasingly to other devices as well. And speaking of Amazon, they do a great job personalizing the shopping experience as well. So you can see recommendations based both on your own browsing and buying history, as well as data collected on other shoppers who are similar to you, who shop for similar items. The algorithm does a really great job picking up on subtle preferences, such as the fact that my kitchen accessories are red. And this is a way that it can help you feel like you have a relationship with them, like they really see and understand you. You can also incorporate peer-to-peer social relationships into your experience to support relatedness. So for example, Goodreads lets you network with friends to share book reviews and recommendations. And that adds a social component to something that really traditionally is a solo activity. On the right, you see Fitbit, the wearable fitness tracker, and they found that users who participate in their social network get 27% more steps than people who don't. So that's pretty cool. This webinar is called Engagement is Everything, and I do believe that that's true. But I do want to make the point that engagement with your digital experience is not always everything. There are times when the focus either can't or shouldn't be on clicks, and those times include when the key behaviors take place away from the digital experience. So healthy eating, physical fitness, keeping to a budget, these behaviors usually take place away from the screen. The user may come to the digital experience in order to learn the needed skills to execute on these behaviors, to get inspired and motivated, to track progress. But even more important than them using the digital experience is that they are engaging that behavior offline where it really counts. If your digital experience supports behaviors that don't happen very often, then your engagement focus also shifts. So estate planning, for example, may happen once a decade or so. People file their taxes once a year. So in these sorts of cases, obviously you still want an easy-to-use, delightful digital experience, but you're no longer focused on engaging people over the long term in the same type of way. And then finally, depending on what your digital experience is, a user's needs may change over time, and then their disengagement signals growth and not a product failure. So someone who's running a half marathon doesn't need to log into Couch to 5K anymore. A mom of a toddler isn't going to use the Healthy Pregnancy app anymore. Someone who's gotten really good at budgeting and has achieved a savings goal may move on to looking at investments. None of these imply anything negative about the digital experience left behind, and if anything, this is an area where disengagement may mean the digital experience was successful. So I want to wrap by sharing a few examples that support autonomy, competence, and relatedness all in one package. The first is a MadPow case study. So we built a program for reflection health using Kinect, which is a motion sensor control for the Xbox. And the program helps people complete physical therapy at home. So it supports all three of those needs. It supports autonomy by giving people choice about how to represent themselves on the screen and how to tackle the exercises. It supports competence by structuring the activities in the form of a hero's journey. So it progresses from the easiest tasks to the hardest ones. And it facilitates relatedness by connecting patients to their physical therapists so they can receive support and guidance through this virtual channel. Research on the program suggests extraordinary engagement, which you can see down here, in terms of adherence to PT. To track my runs. Delighted to see the 2015 year in review summarizing all of my activity for the year last year, and I was not just because I'm a data nerd. The overview really supports all the fundamental needs. So first, it shows how all the activity I did individually ladders into a meaningful statistic. So I evidently ran 1.1 times from New York City to Miami, which is pretty cool. So autonomy and competence. And then speaking of competence, there's an Ifthens calculator, which is one of the tools that I spoke about before, and it lets me see if for 2016 I worked out more per month, less per month, what would that do to my miles, my calories burned, my duration spent exercising. So it really helps me figure out how to influence my statistics for the coming year. And then finally, in addition to showing me what my own workouts add up to, it also shows me that I'm part of a worldwide community of runners. So you can see here, this is what all of the runners who track through Map My Run, what their work ladders up into. So it will be interesting to see if this is a program that continue in future years, but it really, I thought, did a nice job of taking everything that I'd done for the past year and helping me feel that there was some meaningfulness to it. Now, before I open it up for questions, I do want to ask for your vote on the South by Southwest panel picker for our proposed presentation, Moral Issues in Designing for Behavior Change. So we'll be debating on some of the things that I spoke about today, when to respect user autonomy and when to impose your expert values from a variety of different perspectives. The other panelists include my MadPow colleagues, Dustin D. Tomaso and Dan Berlin, and then my friend Raphael O'Day from Johnson & Johnson, who's a clinician, really great speaker as well. We all bring very different backgrounds and areas of expertise, so we would love to be able to present to you and hope you will vote. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. Thank you all so much, and I believe we have time for some questions.
Yes, thank you, Amy, for that awesome presentation. We have a few questions that popped up. The first one is, if a person wants to dig into behavioral psychology in a helpful and non-creepy way, where might I explore further?
Okay, so I'm interpreting the question as asking about further resources to learn more about how to apply these things. And I would say, actually, I do keep a resources page on my website, which you can see listed here, amybucherphd.com, but it includes links to places like SelfDeterminationTheory.org. They do an awesome job of warehousing their published papers on self-determination. education, they make it really easy to dig into that published research in each of those areas. There are also some really great blogs and websites out there. I think, actually, she's not a psychologist, but I think Gretchen Rubin does a great job of applying psychology and behavior change to real-world experiences, again, not in a creepy way. So to go back to that Google Now example, that's something that could very easily be creepy, but I gave my consent at every point of the way to let them look at my email, to let them track my location, to let them know which GPS was my home and which GPS was my work. So because I know exactly where they're getting that data and that they have my permission to do it, it doesn't feel creepy. So I'd say definitely just be transparent, ask for permission, and yeah.
Great. The next question is, how do these motivational principles relate to gamification?
Yeah, so gamification is a really popular buzzword now, and what gamification means, I think people sometimes interpret it as meaning that something is like a game. Technically what it means is that there are game elements brought into an experience. So some of the tactics that I showed you actually would technically count as gamification, things like leaderboards, things like badges, skill points. So Duolingo has a lot of gamification built into it. And I think part of the reason why gamification has become so popular and such a buzzword is that these tactics do reinforce the fundamental needs in many ways, if they're applied well. So a leaderboard, for example, can do a great job of helping build competence by showing how your performance stacks up to other people, and supporting relatedness by showing you that you're not the only one engaging with an experience. I think the danger is when people really get hung up on having it be the game experience versus let's put in these elements in order to support something meaningful. Then you might end up with a game type experience that doesn't actually achieve the outcomes that you have in mind.
Awesome. Another question, what kinds of cross-cultural differences are there in the fundamental human needs?
Oh, good one. Yeah, okay, so cross-cultural differences. This is actually really interesting because a lot of psychological theories do play out very differently across cultures. Self-determination theory in general holds up fairly well across cultures. Regardless of what your background is, your origin is, you do have these fundamental needs for autonomy, for competence, for relatedness. What research has found, the one area where there may sometimes be variation is between Eastern and Western cultures on that autonomy dimension. So, and this is, I'm painting this with a very broad brush, but Western cultures in general tend to be more independent, while you see more interdependence in the Eastern cultures. And so you may see people who think about the family unit more in terms of autonomy in Eastern cultures, where in a culture like the United States, we do tend to be very individualistic and I'm not, if my parents want me to do something, I may not feel that same sense of ownership or autonomy that you might see in some other cultures. For the most part, it really does stack up very well, though, across cultures.
Great. And last question we have is, do people vary in their need to have autonomy, competence, and relatedness?
Yes, they do. They do. So people do vary in their need qualities. They do not. Everybody does have some need for them. There's nobody who's at zero. One researcher who did some work that I really enjoy related to this is Marilyn Brewer. She does work on optimal distinctiveness is the term that she uses, but she has found that people vary in how much they want to be part of a group versus stand out from less. And what she found is even the most individualistic people, even the people who are most comfortable standing out from a group and being their own person and not following the crowd, they still do need that sense of connection with other people. So there is a lot of individual difference in how much people need it. And I think that when you're designing a program, that's one reason why it's very important to understand your intended end user and how they're going to interact with your program. But there is there's nobody who doesn't need any of these things.
Great. Thank you so much, Amy. That's all the time we have for today, but if you have contact information register for our upcoming webinar happening on